Phosphorus is one of the nutrients that's crucial for life. It's part of the makeup of DNA and of cell membranes, so all life needs access to phosphorus. Phosphorus is also present in agricultural soils, but there are various reasons why farmers choose to add more than what's already present in the soils. Some soils are very deficient in the amount of phosphorus that's there. In all cases where grain is harvested and removed, they include some phosphorus that then needs to be replaced. And in other cases where the phosphorus isn't particularly deficient, it's still possible to increase crop yields by applying more. So farmers typically, often, choose to provide phosphorus in fertilisers to their crops. This photo shows some corn plants that are phosphorus deficient. You can see from the purpley brown colour, which is characteristic of phosphorus deficiency, that these plants won't yield very high yields of corn compared to if they had plenty of phosphorus available. These days, phosphorus is mainly obtained from mining of rock phosphate. And each year around the world, we mine around 170 million tonnes of rock phosphate. It's estimated that there are around 65 billion tonnes of rock phosphate out there, somewhere in the world, but only a minority of that, around 16 billion tonnes, is judged to be economically viable to actually mine. The rest of it's too inaccessible or too deep or in a form that's not easily mined. And around 80% of the relatively accessible phosphate rock is in two countries, Western Sahara and Morocco in Africa. One of the characteristics of phosphorus that makes it particularly important is that, unlike nitrogen, it's not possible to chemically synthesize phosphate fertiliser. It has to be obtained from a source like rock phosphate. So that raises the question, will we run out of phosphorus? Various people have talked about the concept of peak phosphorus, which is a bit like the idea of peak oil that gets talked about quite a bit. So peak phosphorus is the time when global phosphorus production will reach its maximum rate and easily, cheaply accessible phosphorus will have been exhausted, after which we expect that the availability and the ability to access and mine phosphorus will fall away quite sharply. This diagram shows one possible way that could play out. You can see the blue shapes there show the record of actual mining and extraction of phosphorus, and the red line is a sort of a projection or prediction about what might happen in future. In this case, it will come to a peak in a couple of decades and then start to fall away. Now, one of the big uncertainties is about when that peak will occur. And this is very difficult to judge. You need to consider a lot of information to be able to judge it. We need to know about what the actual level of reserves are that are out there, what's the cost of extracting them and how that might change over time, whether there could be improvements in the technology of extracting and mining rock phosphate, possible reductions in waste of phosphorus. A lot of phosphorus currently is wasted in the system. Improvements in the technology for application of phosphorus fertiliser, possibly changes in the demand for food in future, and the levels of recycling of phosphorus that might occur in the future. So all of those things are relevant to trying to predict when peak phosphorus might occur. Timing estimates, understandably, vary quite widely as different people make different judgments about these things. And so you can find out there predictions that range from about 20 years to well over 100 years. Corbell and some colleagues in 2009 published a paper when they predicted that peak phosphorus would occur in about 2030 and that we would have complete exhaustion of phosphorus supply in between 50 and 100 years. At the other end of the spectrum, or at least in quite a degree of contrast, the International Fertiliser Development Centre predicted that peak phosphorus will occur after the end of this century and that we have enough phosphorus to last for several hundred years. So, who's right? How should we look at these two contrasting predictions? What are some of the arguments for a relatively early peak in the mining of phosphorus? Well, one is that we know that easily accessible phosphorus is being depleted. It's getting steadily more difficult. And we also know that food demand is growing and will continue to grow as the population grows around the world. So both of those things would tend to make you expect a relatively early time for peak phosphorus. On the other hand, there's some arguments for relatively late peak phosphorus. One is that as phosphorus becomes scarcer and scarcer, we know from supply and demand that its price will increase. And high prices for any commodity have some pretty important implications and consequences. So in the case of phosphorus, we'd expect that high prices would encourage people to go out and explore for additional reserves of phosphorus. We also expect that high prices would mean that relatively expensive methods of extracting phosphorus would start to become economical. Methods that currently aren't viable would become viable if the price got high enough. And the third consequence of high prices would be that it would encourage users of phosphorus and processors of phosphorus to innovate in various ways to try and conserve it and make it last for longer. And that's important because, and there are opportunities here, because most applied phosphorus is actually wasted. Only a minority of it is actually taken up by crops. Another factor here is that there's quite a degree of scope for recycling of phosphorus, of used phosphorus, capturing it and reusing it, whereas at the moment there's very little, almost none of that occurs. And as a result of extra exploration and perhaps new technology, we're quite likely to be able to find new deposits of phosphorus. Another factor that sort of might play on our minds here is that the early predictions about the timing of peak oil turned out to be way too pessimistic. The amount of oil that's available, we now believe, is much higher than we believed in the early years when people were first predicting when peak oil would occur. So it's probably the case that something similar will occur for peak phosphorus as well. We do have some experience of trying to cope with relatively scarce or perceived scarcity of phosphorus. So at about the time of the food crisis that we talked about, 2006 to 2008, there was also a peak in the price of fertiliser, and especially of phosphorus fertiliser. You can see that from the graph here. So what are some of the consequences of high phosphorus prices that we would expect to occur after we reach this point of peak phosphorus? Well, one of the factors, obviously, is that farmers' costs will increase. And that means that the supply curve for food will go up because the cost of production, the marginal cost of food supply, will go up. Okay, now this graph shows various things. It shows higher prices will be one of the results, and that will lead to lower equilibrium demand for food. So the marginal cost has gone up, we end up with a higher equilibrium price, and we end up with a lower equilibrium demand for food. And there are a couple of reasons for that lower equilibrium demand. One is that people choose to buy less food. They trade off food with other things that they could buy, and because of the higher cost, they choose to buy less. And another reason is that they can afford less. So relatively poor, particularly people in poor countries, on low incomes, can't afford to purchase so much food, and so the high price means that just there's less purchased. Now, one of the factors about food is that it's considered a necessity. We need to eat, and so compared to some other things that we buy, the demand curve for food is much steeper. The actual quantity demanded doesn't decrease as rapidly as price increases compared to other goods. So what that means is that the consequences of increased marginal cost will mainly be felt by consumers, and the high price will mean that farmers get an increased revenue, which partially offsets the higher costs and lower quantity that they will face. So this is quite a complex story. The marginal cost of food goes up because of the higher cost of phosphorus. That increases the price that consumers face. They reduce their demand, the amount that they'll actually choose to buy. That has a negative consequence for farmers, but the higher price has a positive consequence for farmers. So there's a bit of a win and lose situation for agriculture. Now, I talked about the slope of the demand curve, and to finish off today, I just want to talk about the concept of the elasticity of demand, which is a concept or a term that economists use to refer to this slope of the demand and supply curves. So on the left-hand side in this slide, you can see a demand curve that is highly inelastic. The quantity doesn't change much as the price changes. Whereas on the right-hand side, you can see a demand curve that is highly elastic. As the price changes a little bit, the quantity demanded changes a lot. So the graph on the left-hand side would be relevant mainly to necessities like food, whereas the graph on the right would be mainly relevant to luxury goods, goods that we could do without and would choose to do without if the price went up too much. The same sort of concept can apply to supply curves as well. So on the left, we've got a graph which has an inelastic supply curve, and on the right-hand side, a graph with an elastic supply curve. An inelastic supply curve means that as the price changes, then we don't get much change in the amount of supply. Whereas again, if the price changes a little bit, when we have an elastic demand curve, we get quite a big change in supply. And the elasticity of supply and demand combine to determine how things will change, what will happen to price and quantity as something like marginal cost changes due to an event like peak phosphorus. To summarise then, phosphorus, one of the key points about phosphorus is that there is no substitute for phosphorus and it can't be artificially produced. Peak phosphorus is a concept that's widely discussed, and when it eventually occurs, it'll have quite significant consequences. But I think overall, for the reasons that I've put, the peak level of peak phosphorus probably won't occur that soon. It's likely to be later rather than really soon. But when higher phosphorus prices do occur due to peak phosphorus, this will lead to higher costs to farmers, but also to some degree at least, higher revenues and higher cost to consumers, who are likely to suffer in the medium term once markets equilibrate. They're likely to suffer more than the farmers do.